and I'm bored.
And I'm so bored of this game.
I'm so bored.
Hello, fellow Clixers. It's Clifford here from Clicks with Clifford, bringing you another how to play Heroclix video. Today we're going to be covering the maps used to play Heroclix. More specifically, we're going to go over all the colors that you see when you're looking at a map so that you can have a better understanding of what you're looking at while you're trying to learn to play the amazing game of Heroclix. Let's get into it. Okay, and this is what a standard Heroclix map looks like. It's rows of squares that are colored or not colored with images on the inside. Pretty standard. They all pretty much look similar to this. They'll have different layouts with more walls, different elevation, different terrain, all sorts of stuff. They come in every form that you could possibly think of, between wide open to completely enclosed tunnels and stuff like that. Now, there are two types of maps that we use, two sizes of maps that are used in Heroclix. We have these bigger ones, like shown on screen right here, which is 16 squares by 24 squares. Now, these are the size of maps that Heroclix has used for years, and until recently, that was the size that we used. And now we're going on to maps that look like this. They're a little bit smaller. They are 16 squares by 16 squares, a literal square map. A little bit smaller. They kind of got rid of some of the length there, which is fine. So there are the two sizes of maps, the bigger ones and the smaller ones. You can use both. There's not really anything stopping you from using either size map, unless you're playing in the modern era, which we'll cover eras later, in which you have to choose between maps that are modern, that are within basically the past 2 years of Heroclix release. And starting here in about a month with the 2023 rotation, there's going to be very few big maps that is available, and a lot of more smaller maps being released and that are going to be allowed to be used, with the following year probably rotating out all of the big maps and only leaving us with small maps as far as modern is concerned, leaving all of the other maps to be in Silver Age. Now, they do come in two different materials. We've got these ones that I've been showing you that are made out of a cool neoprene material. They're typically prize maps that you get for win-a maps or state events, stuff like that. And then the far more common paper maps, which are released in starter sets and OP kits and all sorts of stuff. They are way more common. You'll see them all over the place. Okay, so the point of this video is going to be to explain the basics of what all the colors on a map are, so that when you're trying to play Heroclix, you have a basic understanding of what you're looking at and how they interact with your characters. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is cover the purple squares, indicating here they are the starting areas, is what they are. They don't affect the gameplay in any way other than that that's where your players have to start the beginning of the game. Sometimes they're more a giant chunk out of the corner, and sometimes they're just like this, where they're just a big row, and the opposing starting area is going to be the exact opposite of the map from where you are. So this purple line is exactly the same on the other side of this map. Now, you can start anywhere in this starting area. You can be all the way up against the wall, you can be up front, you can be next to each other, you can be further away, you can have one all the way over here, one here. Doesn't matter as long as you're within those purple squares. Now, on the smaller square size maps, the 16 by 16, there will be no purple starting area, because they've changed the starting area to just be the edge of the map from whatever side of the map you start on. So all your guys just have to be in the square closest to the starting area as possible. Okay, so the first concept that we're going to cover is that all squares on the map are considered terrain. Doesn't matter what kind of color it is, whether it's like these brown ones, these red ones, green, doesn't matter. They are all a subset of terrain. The first one we're going to cover is the easy one, and it's going to be clear terrain. An example of those would be like these 4 squares right here. They have no border surrounding them, just the grid indicating where the squares are. Those don't mean anything as far as terrain, just where the squares are. And they have no color around them. They're considered clear terrain. During normal gameplay, they usually have no outstanding effects. You can move through them freely, shoot through them freely. They don't add anything, they don't subtract anything. They're clear terrain, generic squares that you can just use as you want. The very first color that we are going to actually cover that is different is going to be hindering terrain, which is indicated by these green squares. We have some here and here. They are very common and usually present on most maps. Not all, but most maps have some form of terrain. Now, hindering terrain is unique in that it provides two main bonuses. The first one is that if a line of fire between the person shooting and its target, say he's shooting at this Batman here, the target gets a +1 to their defense. So if the bat here was shooting at this Batman here, that Batman would get a +1 to his defense value. That counts if you are occupying the terrain or if the line of fire is simply drawn through a square into him. So if he was here, the line of fire was drawn through this green terrain into him, he still gains the +1 defense. You don't need to occupy it, you just need the line of fire to be drawn into it, and you still maintain the bonus if you do occupy it. Now, one thing to note here, though, is if, say, this Batman was outside of the hindering terrain shooting at this Batman here, this Batman would get the +1 to his defense, but if this one was shooting back at this one, he is no longer have his line of fire hindered. The square that the person occupies does not count, so it's just the squares going out. So him shooting at him, +1 defense, him shooting at him, there's nothing. Now, the second bonus that it provides comes in the ability Stealth, the power Stealth. It is indicated by a black square on the movement. You can watch my previous video showing you what the dials look like and explaining the color squares, but the movement black is Stealth, and that means that if a line of fire is hindered, then you cannot target that character. So in the case of these two here, if he was shooting at this Batman who has Stealth, he would not be able to make that attack. Another thing to note is if you are adjacent, that is in a square next to another square, as in you're going to make a close attack, you're going to try and punch this guy, there are no bonuses applied. So he can attack him without any bonus, and he can attack him without any bonus, and you also don't get to use Stealth against adjacent opposing characters. Now, one thing I'm also going to note as well is that previous rules had you stop when you moved into hindering or half your speed moving out of hindering. Those are no longer a rule. So now hindering affects movement in no way whatsoever. You can move through, out of, across, without having to have any detriment to your actual movement. The next color that we're going to cover is going to be these brown squares here. These are called blocking terrain. They are used in the game to indicate big objects that you wouldn't be able to see through. In this case, some form of statue. It could be buildings, anything big that would stop you from seeing somebody on the other side of it. There are two sets of blocking terrain. There is indoor terrain and outdoor blocking terrain. To tell the difference between those, what you need to do is look on the map where you can find the name of the map. In this case, it's called Aporthodes Temple, and then it says if it's indoor or outdoor afterwards. In this case, it is outdoor, indicating that all the blocking that is here is outdoor blocking terrain. And I'll explain what the difference is in just a minute. Now, the main effect of blocking terrain is exactly what it sounds like. It blocks your line of fire past it, to anything beyond the point of that. This Batman here cannot see any of the squares directly going across that way. He can't see the Batman on the other side of the wall, for instance. You won't be able to draw a line of fire, you can't make attacks, anything like that. One of the important things to know about blocking terrain is that you cannot, under any circumstance, be in the same square as blocking terrain, like this Batman here. Even if you have an ability that would, say, allow you to move through blocking terrain, you could never land on top of it. Doesn't matter if you can teleport, doesn't matter if they can fly, you can never occupy the same square as blocking terrain. You must be able to finish your move outside of it in a clear square of terrain. Or any other color, really, just anything but blocking terrain. Okay, now the difference between indoor and outdoor terrain is very minimal. The only difference is that if you have the ability to ignore blocking terrain for movement, is that you can only, like say flight, for instance. Flight allows you to move through outdoor blocking terrain. It doesn't allow you to move through indoor blocking terrain. That is basically the only difference between the two. There are some special powers out there that grant you things based on which type it is, but for general gameplay, there's no difference between the two except for movement. The next color that we're going to cover is going to be these blue squares here. I'm also going to use this as an opportunity to show how sometimes WizKids, when they're making these maps, will sometimes not color in all of the squares all the way around in blue, Instead, they'll just have the whole set just surrounded by blue, as in this case here. They do the same with all the other colors as well. Just thought I'd point it out this time around so you weren't too confused and that each square wasn't individually surrounded. It was just the whole group all together. Now, water terrain is one of the weird terrains because in most games, it does very little. It doesn't obscure your line of fire, it doesn't block your line of fire, you don't have to stop when you're moving into it, it don't get bonuses for occupying it. It really doesn't do a whole lot unless you have the dolphin movement symbol. Now, if you watched my previous video, I showed you exactly where you can find that dolphin symbol if your character has it. It usually applies to characters that are very obvious water characters like Shark or, I don't know, Aquaman, someone like that who lives in water. And we'll cover what those symbols mean in a future video. Now for the last and most complicated of the terrain types, and that is elevated terrain, which is indicated by red squares like the ones shown right here. These are the ones that are most likely to confuse people and get the most questions from new players. The first thing I'm going to point out about elevated terrain is transition squares, indicated by this little arrow type thing right here. Now you'll notice they'll have two numbers in them, one will be lower and one will be higher, and this indicates which square is higher than the other one. So a 1 is lower than 2, with 2 being higher than 1, so now this Batman is above these squares down here. It is used in the game to indicate anytime someone goes up a significant amount of stairs or up a ladder, something like that, where they would now be above the battlefield, as to say. Now these transition squares also have another function, in that those are the squares that you can move up and down elevation. So for instance, if this Batman wanted to move from this elevation down to here, he would have to use these transition squares to keep moving along. Now this doesn't apply to people that can fly or phasing and teleport, stuff like that, but we'll get to that later. We are now only talking about people that move normally. The next thing will be moving without using transition squares. Previous to around, I think it was last year when they made the rules change, you couldn't move from one elevation to another without using transition squares. Now with the new rules, you are allowed to move from one elevation to another, whether that's up or down, one square. So, well, more than one square, but if you are moving along and you transitioned from one elevation to the next, you immediately have to stop, and that is for both up and down. If you're going up, you now have to stop, and if you go down, you now have to stop, and that is only, again, if you do not avoid elevation by some means. Another thing with transition squares is if you are moving, you cannot move diagonal along them. You have to follow the arrows along in order to keep moving. Now, line of fire and elevation, this is where most of the questions come into play. The first concept we're going to cover in regards to this is called the rim. Now, that is any square where the elevation is different than the square next to it. So right here, anywhere along this line from here to there, that's called the rim of elevation. Now, if you want to be up and shoot down, you have to be along this rim of elevation in order to shoot down. So if this Batman wanted to shoot at this guy, he would have to be along this line. If he were here, he would not be able to draw line of fire to him, and vice versa. And the same goes for here. This Batman can see him, this one can see them. Now we're going to cover elevation, or not elevation, but other squares that are between characters of different elevation. In this case, we have hindering squares, which is now lower than this Batman here, right in between the two of them. Now, elevation has a unique ability in that it allows you to see over other squares. So in this case, this Batman would see over that square to this Batman, basically ignoring that there's any hindering here at all. And now this would apply also if there were another person in between the two. Normally, line of fire could not be drawn from one character through him to this character, but because he is now higher than this one, they are not adjacent, he can see over, he can now target this Batman as much as he wants. In the case of getting the bonus from hindering, because he is above, you do not draw a line of fire through the square, it's kind of like a more at an angle, right? So it ignores that elevation, or that hindering, and you can just shoot that Batman without the bonus, and they don't gain stealth. Now, the main question that's going to come into along is to say hypothetically that green square was actually brown. It was a piece of blocking terrain. Now, in the rules right now, indoor blocking terrain and outdoor blocking terrain, it doesn't matter. If you are at higher elevation, you cannot draw line of fire over it. So if this square was blocking terrain, he would not be able to see this Batman, no matter how many elevations above this one it was. Okay, everybody, and that's going to be it for today's video. Today I showed you the Heroclix map, showed you all the colors that are on there, and exactly what they do. And if you have any questions whatsoever, just leave down in the comment section below your questions so that I can answer them to the best of my ability. I know that some of the squares get a little bit confusing, the whole game gets a little bit confusing, but hopefully I did my best to explain it to you. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you are learning anything, if you love Heroclix and just want to support the entire community. Thank you again for watching.
But we were too bored to wait in line.